On this episode of The Secret Gardens, an insider's tour of outdoor beauty in the nation's capital. We'll visit a cloistered garden sanctuary where historic relics tell a Gothic tale.
This is the best-kept secret in Washington, D.C.
Also, a secluded water garden harbors an ancient mystery. And we'll go behind closed doors to visit a private Washington garden on a slippery slope. Our private tour is just ahead on the secret gardens of Washington, D.C. Nearly every street in Washington, D.C. is a walk through history. The towering Capitol building sets the tone for city center. Here, classic symbols of American politics provide a patriotic backdrop for tourists, residents, and politicians alike. Washington's public buildings were designed to convey the important work conducted behind their doors. And some landmark structures were designed more for grace and beauty. Washington's National Cathedral towers high on a hill overlooking the Capitol. Visitors here are humbled by the size and scope of the cathedral's Gothic beauty. But if they can pull themselves away from the indoor wonders, they'll discover a hidden treasure right outside.
This is the best-kept secret in Washington, D.C.
This is the Bishop's Garden, cloistered behind a medieval gate across the street from the cathedral. It's only 100 yards from the cathedral's front doors, but stone walls ensure the garden is a well-kept secret.
It is a real island of tranquility in an otherwise very bustling metropolis.
Catherine Warnell is one of the many volunteers who nurture this unique garden. Originally the private sanctuary for the cathedral's Episcopal bishop, it's now open to anyone who can find it. The garden was designed in 1928 by Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., whose father created New York's Central Park.
They wanted to create a garden for the ages, a garden where people could come, meditate, enjoy a quiet moment.
The cathedral's location and Gothic design provided inspiration for the Bishop's Garden. The cobblestone path is the first step in the journey back in time. First stop, the 15th century, when European carvers created this bas-relief. Now, it's a centerpiece of this small courtyard. Nearby, there's the framework of an even earlier time.
The arch itself is a 12th century Norman carriage arch.
And in a city with scores of historic monuments, one ancient relic here is a standout.
The baptismal font that we're looking at is Carolingian, which basically means that it dates back to the time of Charlemagne.
And there's no reason to wonder what grew in the 9th century, because this Gothic garden is true to its roots.
What we've done here in this garden is to draw from sources that would have been dated back to Charlemagne, so 9th century. Charlemagne's plant list, the plan of St. Gall, and then the poem Hortulus by Walafrid Strabo, who was a monk.
Those plant lists call for rosemary, dill, parsley, and sage. But these herbs did not go in medieval meals.
All plants that basically would have been used for medicinal purposes, strewing herbs, not really any sort of culinary things.
Hidden behind a boxwood hedge is a tranquil rose garden. Admittedly, not the most famous rose garden in Washington. It was created so that every visitor here has something to savor.
the landscape architect. His idea was that even blind people could come and enjoy the garden because of the delicious scent of the roses. I think that's a wonderful touch.
But perhaps the most wonderful touch is this garden's quiet embrace of American history. It's a well-kept secret, unless you're in the know.
Since we are a national cathedral, we've tried to implement or put into the garden things that have historic significance.
There are historical treasures hidden all around this garden. Things like a garden foundation linked to the nation's founding father.
The basic structure of the courtyard was quarried from stone that was taken from George Washington's Aquia Creek Quarry.
A few steps away, the secret calling card of Martha Washington. These unique pie-shaped bricks came from her family's home. And if these walls could talk, they'd reveal another historic secret. These bricks were once used in President Grover Cleveland's home. And the amazing connection to American history here just keeps growing.
We have boxwood that was taken from Dolly Madison's inaugural bouquet. We have ivy that was taken from cuttings in France on D-Day. It's just a conglomeration of all these different things that sort of, in a quintessential way, is the American ideal. I mean, it's just a conglomeration of everything.
This secret refuge does indeed embody the American spirit. It's a quiet resting spot where our historic treasures are hidden amid spectacular natural wonders. Coming up, from swampland to garden oasis, the mysterious beauty here has a ripple effect. Later on, an invitation from a diplomat brings us to a hidden haven of tranquility, Japanese style, when The Secret Gardens continues.
Join HGTV on a journey into the world of the unusual on our tour of America's haunted houses. July the 10th, 9 Central on HGTV.
Water adds a sparkle to Washington, D.C., and it's everywhere. Like the changing tides of politics, the Potomac River helps define the city. Major Pierre L'Enfant designed Washington next to the river back in 1791. At that time, much of the water's edge was a wetland. Today, most wetlands are filled in and built up. But there's an amazing exception hidden on one of the Potomac's tributaries. It's a secret garden that celebrates its aquatic roots.
People are so used to traveling through the city and the hustle and bustle of the inner city, but to enter through the gates and to smell the flowers, to see the tranquility of all the beauty here, they're just so surprised.
Kenilworth Aquatic Garden is a rare flower in the National Park System. It's the only aquatic garden owned by the United States and has some of the most unusual blooms in the world.
With the rare flowers, the tropical lilies, the hardy lilies, the ancient lotus that has a seed germinated over 900 years, it's such a unique place.
Kenilworth is a 12-acre sanctuary tucked into Washington's far northeast corner, a place where no one expects to find pristine property. And although it's now a public garden, it was created for private use. Civil War veteran Walter B. Shaw bought this swampland from his in-laws back in 1880. He worked for the U.S. Treasury Department and turned his modest salary into his own type of green.
And he wanted to bring some beauty to this area. He began to transport flowers, and particularly the hardy lilies, from his home state of Maine.
With help from his daughter Helen Fowler, Shaw created a unique flower lily business. This was a family that loved to try something new.
She's credited for being the first female in the Washington, D.C. area to own and operate a truck. And from that truck, she sold the flowers that we see out here today.
The Park Service purchased the gardens in 1938, and they remain essentially the same as when Shaw created them. The passing years have revealed that Shaw was a very lucky gardener. He just happened to buy property perfect for lilies.
It's never too hot, never too cold, so we don't have the extremes. And we find that, particularly here in Washington, D.C., we have the ideal place for aquatic gardening.
The aquatic plants fill 12 ponds here. One of them grows only fragile tropical lilies, whose blooms wilt by mid-morning. Hardy lilies thrive here because of nature's nightly pruning.
We have the beaver here, who has been termed our busy gardener. He keeps the gardens blooming.
This unusual double-blooming lotus towers over aquatic irises that rim the ponds. But the big attraction at Kenilworth is an ancient mystery. In 1957, the Park Service was given a 900-year-old lotus seed. It had been found in a dry Chinese lake bed. They knew it was a common eastern lotus. What they didn't know was whether an ancient seed would grow. So gardeners planted it, and the seed gave up its secret. The lotus did bloom over and over and over again.
There are probably as many as 15 to 20 calls per day to ask about the lotus. And so it is one of the highlights for the park.
The ancient lotuses are in full glory in July and August. They have waxy 3-foot leaves and blooms the size of cantaloupes. With flowers like these, it's easy to overlook some of Kenilworth's more shy attractions.
We have the frogs, we have turtles, we have some really large snapping turtles as well.
Today, occasional visitors discover the quiet grounds of Kenilworth as they have for generations. It's a rare pleasure with long roots to Washington's political past.
Often, the First Ladies would hold meetings here. In fact, President Calvin Coolidge and his wife would often be found strolling through the gardens on a Sunday afternoon.
Kenilworth has changed little since President Coolidge visited. It's still a hidden oasis in Washington, D.C., just waiting for visitors to discover its true colors. Just ahead, we'll visit a secret hillside retreat which thrives on the shady side of the street.
The garden isn't visible at a single glance, all of it, that you really have to get down and explore and wander here and there.
We'll head to a lush Washington, D.C. hideaway next.
Meet Patty and Laura.
Washington, D.C. is a city of history, politics, and people. With so many politicians, many say this is also a city of secrets. And in one quiet neighborhood, there's no bigger secret than the vast woody garden of Sally Boasberg. From the street, this turn-of-the-century home looks like the other well-tended 2 stories on the block. But stroll up a sidewalk and through a white gate, and the mystery begins to unfold.
The garden isn't visible at a single glance, all of it, but that you really have to get down and explore and wander here and there, so till it does really reveal itself.
Sally lives in Washington's Cleveland Park neighborhood. And here, there's a hiccup in Washington's sea-level terrain.
The garden itself is on a steep hillside.
That hillside is one of Washington's highest points, 300 feet above sea level, and a challenge for any gardener trying to create an impressive planting.
Nobody's ever tried to garden here or anything else of the kind. I think they're always surprised by the lushness and the variations in colors and textures, and the idea that we've carved this out of sort of a wilderness.
It's taken a quarter century to tame the 1-acre hillside, turning it into a lush hideaway. The garden paths are lined with bark, and at first they lead to a planted paradise. It's an overgrown plot with shades of purple and pink. Around a corner, the garden opens up to a new surprise. The pool garden is tucked into the only flat patch of land on the property. A cool white hibiscus mimics the color flickering in the trees. This garden area is just a tease for what's ahead.
And then they see the pool and they don't focus on the fact that there is a great deal to the garden until they start going down. They come to this little stone area, and then there are paths that go off in several directions.
Quarry stone like this is common in Washington, D.C. gardens because it's so plentiful. What's not so common is the attention to detail here. Plants in the lower garden are selected with a purpose. This plant celebrates one of the American presidents.
This plant is called Jeffersonia in honor of our third president, Thomas Jefferson. It's the only plant that's named for him.
The Jeffersonia grows near another plant Sally uses to highlight her garden.
This little variegated hydrangea, as you can see over here, has just a tiny bit of white on the edge, but it's enough to bring light to a dark corner.
From here, the dark corner becomes a hilly haven. Tulip poplar, beech, and hickory trees put a green ceiling on the lower garden.
This is very much of a Washington garden, to the extent that there is quite a lot of shade, which we all need. Particularly, they needed it in pre-air conditioning days.
And that shade forces Sally to turn from color to texture to add interest to the lower garden.
And one of the things that I enjoy so much in gardening is the contrasts of textures and leaf shapes and colors, so that there is a tremendous range.
Sally turned to gardening late in life. When her children left home, she went back to school for her certificate in landscape design. She sees the garden as a link between generations.
I think they remind you in part of your obligation to future generations, as well as your gratitude to the past for what people have done to make the world a more beautiful place. It's like planting trees for people to enjoy 100 years from now.
This is a garden that's ready to be enjoyed now, but only by the lucky few. Those who look around every corner to find all the secrets this garden has to offer. Up next on The Secret Gardens, a rare glimpse of an ambassador's private garden retreat. Accents of Japan coming up next on The Secret Gardens. Washington, D.C. is steeped in American history, but it's truly an international melting pot. Diplomats from around the world make their home here as they conduct business with the government. As you're about to see, many foreign residents here hide a little bit of their homeland on American soil. You might say this garden is coy about its exact location. This is the private garden of Japan's ambassador to the United States, and it's hidden in a neighborhood near Washington's Embassy Row. It's only about a half acre, but all the classic elements of a Japanese garden are here.
Nature is very important to Japanese, and Japan itself is very beautiful. The types of nature that you always see in Japanese gardens are stones or rocks. You see water, and not that many flowers, surprisingly.
Japan's most famous natural landmark is Mount Fuji, and it's represented here in stone. The water that flows from the stone represents a river, which meanders through the garden onto a stony beach and into a calm ocean.
Water is very important to a Japanese garden. It brings peacefulness and serenity.
And the slow, graceful movement of Japanese carp is a subtle enticement for visitors to linger here a while longer. A small path takes visitors through a stand of Japanese maples. Camellias and rhododendrons add texture. And while these plantings may seem random, they're all here for a reason.
There's a lot of work that goes into it that you don't realize, and it's the essence of nature almost captured in a smaller space. And it really fires up the imagination while calming you down.
In a city steeped in American history, this Japanese garden is a true surprise. It's a place that dares to branch out, bringing exotic beauty to a private backyard.